What's that? This is nice?
The poinsettias are beautiful.
Yeah. Yes, Robert and Rachel provided those. Robert and Rachel. They're very nice.
They are beautiful.
Yeah. And I got these candles that were supposed to be really good, but you can see how much this one burned down just on Sunday. And it's supposed to last, well, it needs to last 5 sessions. And you can barely see it as it is, so. Yeah, I already ordered them, so. I already ordered the new ones. AJ's giving me the thumbs up there like he's ready to go, so. What's that? Oh, it is? Good. Yeah, we can edit it. It's not actually streaming live because we had to buy... Yeah, it's up now. We had to record it and then post it later. We're trying to run too much off of one computer up there, so we had to buy another computer, which is being built right now, which will be put in this weekend, hopefully be ready for Sunday. Every time you turn around, somebody needs another $1,000 for something, you know. But the good news is that we have $1,000. What's that?
In the bank Monday.
Oh, good. Praise the Lord. That's great. Okay, well, without further ado, I guess we'll get started here this evening. Okay, here we go. Continuing in our study in the book of Revelation, and we have been going just a few verses at a time. Last week, I think we covered the most ground that we have covered, and we did the entire chapter 5 last week, which brings us to this week, chapter 6, and the ever-famous and even infamous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the 4 horsemen of the revelation of Jesus Christ. That is where it comes from. And this won't actually cover all of chapter 6, but it is in chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles and you want to turn to Revelation, chapter 6, that is where we will be. We'll cover about half of the chapter this evening. We are reminded of the purpose of the book, which is to remind God's suffering people of the victory of Jesus Christ over the power of Satan. So Revelation being, no matter where you want to find its fulfillment, in the first century, in the future, in the present, the story that is being communicated, no matter where you try to find its interpretation, is of God's victory over the power of Satan. So we remember that as we jump in here tonight. And just a quick recap. In chapter 1, we had John's vision of Jesus. He talked about being there out on the Isle of Patmos, and he's given this vision of Jesus. We remember that incredible vision, which is the introduction to the whole book, and it is the revelation or the apocalypse of Jesus. So that could be taken one of two ways. It's either it's information about Jesus that is of Jesus, or it is information from Jesus. And of course, we kind of said that it's really one and the same. It is Jesus communicating to John, to his church, about who he is and his plan, the way that he will be working in the world, presumably in the last days. He's given this vision. He actually sees Jesus, and then Jesus gives him these messages for the churches. Those are in chapters 2 and 3, letters to the 7 churches. And then where we have been for the past couple of weeks is in chapters 4 and 5. And this sets out kind of a courtroom drama. So we are brought into this magnificent scene where John is called up. He hears the voice that says, "Come up here." He's called up into heaven, into God's throne room, which is a courtroom. He sees all of this worship going on. He sees a vision of God sitting on the throne, a vision of Jesus, the slain lamb, all of these different pictures, these 4 living creatures, 24 elders, all of this stuff going on in there. And it is an incredible introduction to all of the things that are about to unfold. We talked last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was that we last met, about how grand the pictures already were and how much kind of imagery and excitement had already been painted, and to think that, that's just the introduction and what else is to come, and we're about to see what else is to come. You will remember that in chapter 5, in that great scene with all of this stuff going on, there is this scroll which is presented that has 7 seals on it, and then John weeps because no one was found worthy to open the scroll and to read it until Jesus shows up. He is the only one worthy to open the scroll and to read it. We looked at these 2 different images of a scroll and how it might be opened ultimately. Doesn't really matter. One of these allows for portions to be opened and read before you get to the next seal, where you would have to then break the next seal so you could open and read the next part there. That would be the bottom one. And then the one on the top, you would, of course, have to break each of the 7 seals before you could read any of it. There are going to be some people who, and we'll look at it tonight, who are going to argue that it's the top version, that all of them have to be broken. There's kind of really no telling. But we are going to cover the first 4 seals tonight, and those first 4 seals are 1 each for the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Definitely some interesting, and as I said, infamous characters. You have heard about the 4 horsemen all of the time. It has become kind of a cultural staple phenomenon. You hear it in pop culture all the time. You see it in movies. You hear it in various avenues. I don't know. The only one I can think of right now, unfortunately, is like wrestling. Wasn't there? I never really watched wrestling, but in professional wrestling, there were like 4 wrestlers, and they were known as the 4 horsemen. I don't know. It happens a lot. But there's been some artist interpretations, if you want to look at those. And here are some. If you remember, you have a white horse, a red horse, a black horse, and what is generally referred to as a pale horse. We'll talk about what all of those things mean, but some people have considered this sort of imagery and what these things look like. That's an older depiction. Here's a newer depiction of it, and you can see there the black and the white and the pale looking very green here in this picture, and the red. We'll come back to why the pale horse is often depicted as a green color as we go, but this is what we will be talking about this evening, these 4 horses with their 4 riders and what they represent. Broadly, just to jump into it, the horsemen represent the judgment of God. So in the broadest sense, you can say that each one of those 4 horsemen represent the judgment of God. It may be observed in the Old Testament with the destruction of Israel in 586, and we will come to that reference in Ezra 14:21. If you want to write it down, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. You have seen pictures, the same sorts of pictures that we get of these horsemen. We have seen that already in the Old Testament. And then see it again in 70 AD, and we'll see that with the preterist take here of John's writing, that there are going to be fulfillments of this again in the life of Israel. So once at the destruction of the first temple in 586 by the Babylonians, again the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD by the Romans, and perhaps there might still be a future and even greater fulfillment of this prophecy of the 4 horsemen coming perhaps against Israel once again for even a third time, or maybe on the whole world. We will see as we go the various interpretations. So that is a just real quick introduction to the four horsemen. And here we go. Giddy up. Yeah, what'd you think about that? That was a good one, huh? We begin. The first horse in the race here is the white horse. And in Revelation chapter 6, and starting in verse 1, this is what John says. He says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. And then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So that is what we are told about this first white horse. I have gone ahead and streamlined our study at this point. We were trying to tackle three interpretive views, and it just got to the point where I said we just can't do three anymore. So we're down to two now. And we are just going to only be looking at the preterist interpretation, that is those who believe that all of these prophecies were fulfilled at the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD, the ones who would say that John was writing about the events that were taking place currently in the life of the church, the preterists, and then also the futurist view, which says that this is a prophecy for the end times that are yet to come. Again, kind of my own personal take, we can have both of these. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can see a fulfillment in the first century, and we can be looking for a greater fulfillment in the future. But of the first horse, the white horse, the preterist interpretation is going to go usually something like this. Some preterists would suggest that the seven seals are in a row. That first picture on the overlapping lip of the document, thus rendering it impossible even to begin opening the scroll until all seven seals are removed. In this view, nothing happens historically until the seventh seal is broken in 8:1. So we talked about that last week and how that might work out. I believe it's here in this quote. Hang on. A careful study of the passage shows that during the seal breaking, no action takes place. The most that chapters 6 and 7 do is introduce the reader to the main characters, forces, and circumstances with which the rest of the section is concerned. They are preparatory to the action which will take place once the book is opened. That's J. Adams. So he is essentially saying, and if you remember, we talked about the fact that if it is all seven of the seals along one edge of the scroll, then what you have is as each seal is being broken, the suspense, the drama is building and building and building. And John is seeing as Jesus breaks the seal, not that anything is happening, but that doom begins to loom greater and greater on the horizon as Jesus is breaking these seals, and he's looking out on the horizon, and more starts piling up out there, which will be unleashed on the earth. So some preterists will take that position, not all of them. However, others believe that with the breaking of the first seal, the progression of events leading to the destruction of Jerusalem begins. That is in 70 AD. Horses represent war. This is, of course, why Jesus came in on a donkey when he came into Jerusalem, not riding in on a horse of conquest, but on a donkey, on an animal of peace, as opposed to the animal of war. But horses have always represented war. People riding on horses in the ancient world in particular always represent war. The first four seals, when broken, release horses with their riders, hence warfare and its accompaniments. And David Clark says it like this: there is no reason for assuming that these four seals or four horses are successive events to the extent of representing successive ages. It is not true to fact that conquest comes in one age, war in another, famine in another, and death in another. That will be the sequence of the horses. So he's saying they don't necessarily have to happen sequentially. They all belong in the same age. They are parts of the same affair. They all go together: conquest, war, famine, death. And if these symbols point to any specific time, there is every reason to believe that they point to the very period in which John was writing and in which the churches were living, and that they had specific references to the last days of the Jewish state at the destruction of Jerusalem. So essentially what he's saying is that this doesn't necessarily have to be progressive, that you can have kind of, while it's being shown in a sort of progressive sense, all of this is befalling kind of Jerusalem all at once, and he's saying that there really is really good reason to be reading this as a symbol of the events that took place in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Since the event of 70 AD with the destruction of the temple and basically the destruction of all of Israel, really, the events were preceded by 3 years of war between the Jews and the Romans. Some take this rider on the white horse to be Vespasian or Titus at the head of the Roman armies. So these would have been the emperors either in the late 60s, early 70s after Nero. And it says, in this first scene, we see the Roman invader advancing to combat, yet the war has not actually begun. He is given his crown, that is victories, by God himself, who is sending these calamities onto the apostate city that killed the prophets and crucified Christ. These are the days of God's vengeance, cited there in Luke 21:22. So this could be, if you're looking for a first century sort of fulfillment, certainly with this first horse, there is nothing actually specifically said to happen. Whereas you will see a little hints of other things happening. This is just some kind of conqueror who's coming on conquest, and what he's saying is this may just represent kind of the leader of the Roman world at the time. Alternatively, the rider could be Christ. Well, that's quite different, isn't it? Seen as going forth to war against his murderers through the calamities about to be revealed. So remember that the judgments befalling the earth, which we'll see a couple times tonight, the earth for a Jewish writer and for the Jewish audience really refers to the nation of Israel, to the world in which the people live in. Like, it wouldn't be a far cry to say that, if all of Newport Richey and the surrounding areas and, say, Central Florida, a nuke got dropped somewhere, like, our whole world would be destroyed as far as, any of us are specifically concerned. And you have these sorts of kind of usage of language where world can just mean Israel. And these judgments befalling, and as we saw when the letters were being written, Jesus is bringing judgments against the synagogue of Satan, which is unbelieving Israel. And these were the things that Jesus prophesied in his Olivet Discourse, which we'll come to a little bit later too, in Matthew 24, when he says, this whole place, everything is going to be destroyed. Not one stone will be left on top of another. This whole nation, this whole land is going to be destroyed. And it is destroyed for the same reason that it was destroyed in 586 BC when God let the Babylonians come in and destroy Israel and haul all the people off into captivity. The reason that he did it then was because they rejected God. And after Jesus came in human form, Christmas, the reason we celebrate Christmas, the Jews still largely rejected him. They still rejected God after he had come and shown himself, so he allowed it to happen again. So the judgments that are taking place, that are coming out here in Revelation, should be understood as being judgments against unbelieving Israel, which John will later on go on to say in his epistles is the spirit of Antichrist, that they are actually being governed by Satan, that Satan is their leader, Satan is their God, not Jesus, not Yahweh, but Satan, as they have rejected Jesus and they have even killed him. So these judgments, we are very inclined to always just think, especially here as Christians in the West, like the Jews are the good guys. In many regards, they are. In many regards, they are the good guys. Even now with the conflict going on, which we'll come to when we get to the end here, I need to quit going off on these trails or we'll never get to it. But we usually want to take sides with the Jews, favor the Jews, God's chosen people, all of that. They are God's chosen people, but they are continually and perpetually rejecting God as he came in the form of Jesus. And God is having to deal with them. Dealt with them in 586. Dealt with them in 70 AD. He may yet deal with them again. And we might be right on the cusp of that happening here right now. So that's the preterist take. They would see it all being there around those events concerning the destruction of the temple. With the futurists, they would see that the breaking of the first seal would be the beginning of the tribulation. There are some futurists who see this rider on the white horse as Christ. So that's common. Most of this comes from, just to kind of clear this up a little bit, how do people get this? Most of this comes from when you get to the end of the book in Revelation chapter 19, there is a rider on a white horse whose name is Faithful and True, and he comes in, and that is Jesus himself. So there are reasons to see this kind of connection. But we'll come to what is, I believe, probably actually going on here. Similarly, some interpret this rider as the proclamation of the gospel in all the world. White is argued to be a symbol of Christ, something associated with Christ, or of spiritual victory. So white generally throughout the whole Bible is usually a good thing. It's usually something that we're wanting to replicate in our own lives. White robes, Jesus in white, all of those various things. So could be that it's Jesus. Some reject this view, however, suggesting that the rider may represent the government or rule in the last days in the hands of Gentiles. It may simply be a symbol of conquest and militarism and invasion from without. F.A. Jennings says the whole context and character of these seals absolutely forbid our thinking of this rider being the Lord Jesus, as so many affirm. His reign shall not bring war, famine, and strife in its train. And yes, that I would agree with that. When you see the rider on the white horse, yes, we get a picture of Jesus at the end that looks like that too, but what is coming either along with or behind this rider? Now, it could be Jesus himself coming in judgment against Israel, again, like some of the preterists like to say, that Jesus himself brings these judgments. Maybe, but there might be something else going on here as well. Most futurists, however, believe that the white horse and its rider represent Antichrist riding forth to conquer the world. The crown given to him is not a symbol of legitimate sovereignty, for then the word for crown would be diadem, but it is a crown acquired by conquest, and that is Stephanos. Stephanos, the crown of the overcomer. So it is essentially saying that he has overcome, he has conquered the world. So his reign or his rule, his authority is not necessarily legitimately his own, but it is something that he has seized for himself, would be kind of the implication that's going on there. And of course, this helps us to kind of understand, if we get a picture of Jesus in Revelation 19 of what he's going to look like in his coming, and if we know that the Antichrist would be somebody who would try to impersonate or replicate the ministry and the life of Jesus, then we would expect when Antichrist comes, he would come in a way that might actually look like Jesus. So it gives us reason to look at this rider on the white horse and say this is probably more an Antichrist figure than it is a Christ figure. So if you go back to the preterist interpretation of it, we can still grant them their interpretation, but we would say it's probably better to see that as the ruling emperor of Rome at the time and not as Jesus leading forth these judgments. Certainly Jesus is allowing the judgments, but it's not actually him leading the charge in them. They would be led by someone else carrying out his bidding on the earth, who would be, at that time, the Roman emperor. So that's how I reconcile the whole thing. The victories would then be given by the power of the dragon Satan. We're going to see that when we get to chapter 13. Talks about it also there in 2 Thessalonians. Satan once told Christ that all the kingdoms of the world were his to give to whomever he wished. And here we see the one to whom Satan finally gives these kingdoms. So you remember, Satan says, these are all mine, and I can give these to you if you would just bow down and worship me. And of course, Jesus refuses to do that because he's not an idiot. But Satan does indeed give all of the kingdoms of the earth to someone at some point, that someone being the Antichrist, and that is the victories that he has there, the authority that he has being given to him from Satan himself. John Wolford says it like this: the rider on the white horse is none other than the prince that shall come of Daniel 9:26, who is to head up the revived Roman Empire and ultimately become the world ruler. He is Satan's masterpiece and the counterfeit of all that Christ is or claims to be. The world ruler of the tribulation, the same individual described as the beast out of the sea in Revelation 13. So, by and large, futurists are understanding this white rider to be the Antichrist, who is showing up onto the scene in the latter days and bringing all of this stuff behind him. He comes in looking like somebody who you might want to follow, somebody who you might want to listen to, somebody who might be bringing peace, but in the end, everything that trails behind him is going to be death and destruction. And then it is hard to ignore here Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, where the first sign of the end times is false messiahs. In Matthew 24, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? And the very first thing that Jesus says will be the sign of his coming at the end of the age is, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. So when the disciples asked Jesus, how's it going to shake down at the end of the world? Jesus says, the first thing you should be looking out for are people pretending to be me. And as we have this sort of sequence of these seals breaking, the first thing that we see could arguably be somebody pretending to be Jesus himself. The plot thickens, though. It's actually very, very interesting because he goes on, and if we're looking at the horses and the colors there, he says, many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, the white horse. And then he says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, the red horse, which is to come right after that one. But see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. And then he says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes, which come along with the black horse, very interestingly. And then he says, all this is just the beginning of birth pangs, which some people interpret to be successive various forms of death. This is all just the beginning. And when you get to the rider on the pale horse, you see that death follows him in a number of different ways. So pretty interesting. I had never actually come across this until I was just getting ready for tonight, and I was like, well, that is pretty fascinating. This actually, and we'll look at this next week as Jesus continues, those are the first 4 seals, and there's actually allusion to the next 3 seals right in the Olivet Discourse happening to be in order too. So pretty interesting. And of course, this may be, a lot of people, preterists, take Jesus' prediction about the Olivet Discourse to be about the destruction of Jerusalem. And then, of course, the futurists are going to say, no, he's talking about the end of the world. Perhaps he's talking about both. Perhaps they parallel or mirror each other. But anyway, very, very interesting. So we continue, so as not to be here all night long. The second horse, the red horse. And John sees another horse. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. And then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword, So second seal opens, and now here comes a fiery red horse with its rider who's carrying a sword, and all kinds of killing and murder follow after him. The preterist, looking for a fulfillment of this in the first century, is going to say that the second horseman represents the loss of peace from the land. That is a preferred translation to earth. It is the Greek word. There is actually gay, which is earth, which can mean either like, the ground. It can mean a large plot of ground, or it can mean all of the ground. So there is some nuance in what is meant there. And of course, the preterist is going to say the land, took it from the land of what? Well, the land of Israel, but it could also be earth. Besides the war that the Jews were fighting against the Romans, suggested by the first seal for the preterist, there were civil wars among the Jews themselves. And Josephus writes a lot about this in his book, The Wars of the Jews, but we have this from Stuart Russell. The Jewish war under Vespasian commenced at the furthest distance from Jerusalem in Galilee and gradually drew nearer and nearer to the doomed city. The Romans were not the only agents in the works of slaughter that depopulated the land. Hostile factions among the Jews themselves turned their arms against one another, so that it might be said that every man's hand was against his brother. So this actually happened. Josephus records some of these events himself. Every city was divided into two armies and camped one against another. So the daytime was spent in shedding of blood and the night in fear. And this, of course, happens whenever there is large looming war. It can, at times, bring people together, but with the Jews, and when you get back into the setting in the first century of Israel, you had all of these various factions between like the Zealots and the Herodians, and even with the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and all of these various groups. And when it starts coming time to we can't toe the line and play nice anymore, then people start taking their sides, and then that ends up erupting into violence against one another, even your own countrymen. Something that you can see tremors of even right here in our own country at this point, can't you? It's not difficult to see how you could turn against your own countrymen. We are politically getting more and more divided all the time, where I don't know which side of the aisle most of you reside on most of the time, but more and more the accusation is being levied from one to the other that the other side is completely evil, right? Everything they're doing is bad. Everything they're doing is wrong. I can't believe they stand for any of this, and it's going both ways. You can understand how we're not too far away from people saying, you don't even really... You shouldn't even really be alive. We can take care of that. We got guns. It's America. And that happened in Israel at this time, that as Rome was coming down to crush them, they started turning against one another. Nicole.
Real quick, just again, the preterists believe that this was fulfilled in the first century, or that it was
Correct.
soon to be. So in other words, because you date Revelation at 95?
Well, the futurists are going to date it at 90, in the mid to early, well, it's somewhere in the 90s. It varies. But yes, call it 95, right in the middle. The futurist will say that. The preterist, who do believe that Revelation was fulfilled in the first century, it only makes sense if it's written before 70 AD. So most preterists are dating Revelation to sometime in the late 60s, like right before 70, that John, and that when he says these are the things that are soon to come. So when we're talking about the preterist view, we're granting that position the early date of the writing of the letter. But yes, most futurists say that it is kind of a looking back to the destruction of Jerusalem, and maybe even using that as a model of the things that are to come. Some of them would say that. I'm actually okay with an early date of Revelation. I think that's okay. Again, we can give it to them and they can have their interpretation, and we can still be looking for a futurist interpretation. But yes, So they would say this all happened in 70 and that John was still predicting it. Steve Gregg says it like this: during the siege of Jerusalem, there was deadly fighting among 3 or 4 antagonistic Jewish camps within the besieged city. The Jews had rejected the Prince of Peace, who had said, while weeping over Jerusalem, if you had known the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. So essentially, peace is being offered to them in Jesus. Now he's gone, and there's no hope for them. The next word Jesus spoke predicted the Roman armies invading the land and leveling the city of Jerusalem. What could speak more directly to the fulfillment of the threat than for Revelation to speak, as here, of one sent to take peace from the land? Zechariah also had predicted this as a consequence of the Jews' rejection of Christ. So this is the taking of the peace from the land, not only from an enemy without, but from within, that all peace has been taken from the land, and it's a reasonable interpretation of the rider on the red horse. The futurist, however, will say that the fiery red color of this horse suggests bloodshed and speaks of a time of war that comes upon the earth as the tribulation progresses. John Wolverd, again, the constant tension among nations and the ambitions of men have their climax in this period before Christ comes. Though wars and rumors of wars are characteristic of the age, it is evident that warfare occupies a large place in the consummation of the age, with the resultant great loss of life. There apparently is a series of wars, the greatest of which is underway at the time of the second coming. So this being one of those, taking peace from the land, and it goes back to that, what Jesus says again in the Olivet Discourse there in Matthew 24:6, and he talks of wars and rumors of wars. And then there's this little bit that often gets misunderstood when he says that nation will rise against nation and kingdom will rise against kingdom. And you might be wondering, what's the difference between a nation and a kingdom? And in our modern kind of context, that is a good question. What is the difference between a nation and a kingdom? They are synonymous today. But the word that is actually used there in the Greek in the New Testament is actually ethnos. It is the word from where we get ethnicity. And there is reason to believe that what the better reading of that in English might be that Jesus would say that ethnicity would rise up against ethnicity and country against country. And you would be having not only wars against country, but race wars within countries. And, as much progress as we have made in the United States of America, if you are so, prone to believe that we've made progress as I am. Some people say that we haven't made any progress. Those are the ones who are still stoking the fires of racial hatred here in this country. And it almost seems as though there are people who want for the races not to get along. And you can put them on either side of that, conflict there, whoever it is, whichever political agenda. There are people on either side that seem to just keep on stoking the fire there, and tensions are rising. And we see movements and things like that happening, and we see race wars happening, and not just here in America, but happening everywhere. And they are precursors, they are tremors to perhaps greater violence and agitation between people groups and countries that is yet to come. Hal Lindsey, the wonderful Hal Lindsey, identifies the rider on the red horse with Russia, with her Arab allies in the Middle East attacking Israel, and places this in the midpoint of the tribulation. So just pretty specific understanding of the rider on the red horse. But again, here, even today, we have Russia doing whatever it is that Russia is doing. And if you don't know the geopolitical scene, I'm not claiming to know it really well, but what I do know is that Russia is up there doing whatever Russia is doing in the Ukraine and trying to do that. And we're, of course, being a little distracted up there. But they are also allied with Iran in the Middle East and a couple other Middle Eastern countries, and with China. And that, of course, falls into that Daniel prophecy and several of those other things. So Hell Lindsey might not be too far off, maybe, perhaps. I think it's a little bigger than just one individual country. But anyway, could be that. The war escalates until it involves all the major powers on the earth and becomes the greatest battle in the history of mankind, the Battle of Armageddon. We will get to that at some point. Understandably, this by Ray Stedman. Many Bible scholars today view the large sword as a symbol of the awesome power of the nuclear bomb. So, who knows? Could be, but war, lots of destruction, lots of death, people killing people, people dying all over the place. It's going to be a little bit crazy. The futurists, of course, kind of have really good reason to make their point here. It is notable that it is only in our current era, with its efficient, high-tech approach to killing, that the fulfillment of these terrible predictions could even come about. Henry Morris believes that this vision also speaks of a time civil wars erupting within nations, organized crime running rampant, and individual feuds generating waves of murders. So essentially just a time of complete unrest in the whole world, and perhaps even at a large scale with nuclear bombs. I don't know if anybody saw the latest Christopher Nolan movie, Oppenheimer. Did anybody see that? About the, what's that?
It's not streaming yet, so I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's on digital platforms. You just have to purchase it. I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan, so I buy all of his movies. So as soon as it was available, I bought it. I wasn't able to make it to the theater, babies and stuff, but very good. And it is about the just couple scenes in there you might want to fast forward through. But it talks about the consequence of nuclear weapons and kind of just pointing to the future of where that's headed. I have mentioned it in here before. Who was it? I don't think it was Einstein, but it was somebody. And they said the Second World War will be fought with nuclear bombs. And he said that the third, no, that's the fourth one. I think he said, I don't know what the Third World War will be fought with, but the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks, because we're moving towards completely destroying ourselves. That's kind of what Oppenheimer's about. Pretty good. Done pretty well. So yes, there is, there's the potential to actually, there's enough nuclear bombs in the world right now to destroy every single living person. And with the mutually assured destruction thing that kind of all of the nations have agreed to, just takes pressing enough buttons and we're all toast. Come quickly, Lord. This brings us to the third horse, the black horse, and this is what John sees. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wage, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wage. And do not damage the oil in the wine. Of course, in your various English translations, you might have different measures there, and different currencies or monetary denominations, but we'll get to that. So there is a general picture of famine here, and the inflation that follows behind it. The preterist is going to say that the scales in the hands of the rider of the black horse seem to indicate that men must eat their bread by measure, as God warned the Jews that they would have to do if they rebelled against him. That's Leviticus 26:26. God says, if you rebel against me, you will be measuring out your food. You'll have essentially barely just enough to survive. And they would say that this is kind of a fulfillment of that warning of the Lord. The horse represents famine and shortage of food. The color black is also reminiscent of famine. Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine, Lamentations 5:10. The denarius was a day's wage for the average laborer. So some of your translations will have denarius. I'm using the NIV. It just changes it to a day's wage, but it's a day's wage is the amount of money that's being talked about in this passage. In return for his work, he is to get a mere quart of wheat, or however many measures it might be talking about there, or about one person's daily ration. Thus, a man would have to work a full day just to earn enough to fill his own belly. To feed a family, he must turn to cheaper grain, which costs only 1/3 as much. So what they're saying is the wheat you can either get, you can work a whole day and you can either get enough wheat for yourself or you can get enough barley for like 2 or 3 people, the cheaper sort of grain. So it is going to be this time of either massive inflation,
You don't say.
or famine, or perhaps a combination of the two. And yes, the futurists, of course, just chomping at the bit to see a fulfillment of this, all of this stuff looming in on us all the time. And I've made mention, and I'm getting tired of even talking about how much it costs to go to the grocery store anymore. It's just like, wow. Wow. This is nuts. And you can see how these sorts of things can begin to happen. Of course, for the preterists, they're looking at a very specific time. And when war ravages a city and when a siege happens on a city, like it did with Jerusalem in 70 AD there, then all of the food supply is cut off. So at that point, there's no more food coming in. The farmers are having a difficult time growing it or supplying enough for everybody. And it starts to get really, really expensive as it starts to shorten the supply. So that could be happening. They could be seeing that in the first century. The Jews in Jerusalem suffered terrible food shortages during the Roman siege. Though initially there was enough food stored up to last a long time, the warring factions in the city regularly destroyed the grain stores of the opposing factions. So they were just coming in and they would destroy their opponent's food. Kind of a good war tactic, I suppose. Thus, food became so scarce that Josephus records at least one case of a mother eating her infant, which we also have a couple examples of in the Old Testament. You can see there. It is with reference to this time that Jesus had said, "But woe to those who are nursing babies in those days." This is from Josephus's Jewish Wars. He says, "Many there were indeed who sold what they had for 1 quart. It was of wheat if they were the richer sort, but of barley if they were poorer." And you have people getting to points of desperation, and you can almost kind of begin to understand it when you've gone days and days and days without food, and you can't even feed your children anymore. And I mean, I really don't think I could ever get to the point of eating my own child. I've never been starving to death before. Who knows? Maybe the kid already died. I don't know, but terrible, terrible times, suffice it to say. And people become very desperate and very unpredictable and crazy when they start starving to death, and you start turning on your neighbors. You will gladly rob your neighbor in order that you and your family could survive, and it starts to get, we have no conception of it. No conception here in this country where we throw food away by the truckload every single day. We can't even conceive of it, but it happens all over the place. The statement, "Do not harm the oil and the wine," could allude to the fact that some sacrilegious Jews pillaged the oil and the wine from the temple. Josephus writes that John Gishala, the leader of one of the factions, confiscated the sacred vessels in the temple, accordingly drawing the sacred wine and oil, which the priest kept for pouring on the burnt offerings, and which was deposited in the inner temple. John distributed them among his adherents, who consumed without horror more than a hin in anointing themselves and drinking. So it could be an allusion to that. It is an interesting little addition there at the end. The futurists have kind of a good take on this. And it says, most futurists understand this horseman, the black one, to represent famine conditions brought on by the warfare in the previous seal during the future tribulation. Few fail to point out that the quart of wheat mentioned was a man's approximate daily need for sustenance, while the amount of money, a denarius, day's wage, was what a common laborer would earn in a day. Thus, the expression meant that it would consume a day's wage to buy a day's supply of wheat, or the same price could buy enough cheaper grain to feed more mouths. So essentially, they understand the same scenario. It's just, is it happening in the first century, or is this going to be something that's happening in the future? Some see this seal as a reference to the power of commerce to generate prosperity or calamity, inflation or depression, bounty or starvation. International capitalists will take advantage of the period of peace to gain full control of the oil, food, and money resources of the world. So the powers that be, the ones in the dark, smoky rooms that you have probably never even heard the names of, who are the ones sitting around deciding what interest rates should be and what oil is going to be distributed where, and all of those sorts of things begin to pull the strings and make things happen and bring destruction. I mean, if you want to destroy a nation, you can either send in a military and shoot them all and bomb them all, or if you have the resources to actually manipulate the supply chain, then you can do that, and it's a much easier and effective way to kill a whole bunch of people. Another possible explanation of the third seal is economic upheaval, inflation, recession, panic. Inflation may well be the justification the Antichrist will use to impose rigid controls over buying and selling, as we shall see in Revelation 13. So, when it starts getting, when it gets to the point when you actually can't even go to the grocery store with the money that you have to buy food for your family, then you start looking around like, who's going to help me? And good old Uncle Sam, you can bet, will be standing there saying, come on, we'll help you. Get in line. And there will, of course, be strings attached. This is when we really need to be praying that the Lord would give us this day our daily bread. Not the other Lord, who ironically will be giving you your daily bread too. Do not harm the oil and the wine, futurist. Some interesting interpretations. Apparently, luxury items will not be in short supply, but of course, most people will not be able to afford them. This situation will only serve to taunt the populace in their impoverished state. So there's going to be stuff there, but you won't be able to touch it. The rich seem to escape a part of this judgment for the oil and the wine. The luxuries of the well-to-do are not to be hurt, he adds. They will receive their share of judgment later. So it was this thing of the haves and the have-nots, basically, right? The poor get poorer, the rich get richer. All those luxury items would be reserved for the people who are still rich, while the rest of us are starving to death. Alternatively, there is also the suggestion that oil and wine were household items in biblical times, that everybody had oil and wine, that they weren't reserved just for the rich. There would be no money left to buy other things such as oil and wine, which were considered essential in biblical times. To put it in ordinary language, the situation would be such that one would have to spend a day's wage for the loaf of bread with no money left over to buy anything else. The symbolism therefore indicates a time of famine when life will be reduced to its barest necessities. So that it could just be bread's going to be really expensive, and don't touch, don't harm, like you won't even be able to, don't even worry about the other stuff because you're not going to get it anyway. That could also be an interpretation. Difficult to say, but we arrive now at the fourth and final horse, the pale horse. And this is what John sees. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So this fourth rider comes in and essentially is just a magnification of the previous two, where he is bringing along with him more and more death on top of the death that has already happened. 1/4 of the population of the whole earth. What's the world population at right now? I thought so. 8 billion. So we'd be talking about 2 billion deaths here, if we're looking for a futurist interpretation. If not, we have nothing to worry about. The preterist, and a good time to point out here that the Greek word translated pale is the Greek word there. It is chloros, which might sound kind of familiar to you. That is from where we get our word chlorine. And the color that it is describing is actually that of, if you have ever, poured chlorine into like a clear glass. It is, I guess, a pale sort of color, but it's not like a white. It's really more like a greenish color. So it is really more like a green. And that is why oftentimes this horse is depicted as being green, because the Greek word actually can mean green. So it could be a green-looking, sickly, gross, kind of like the rotting of flesh sort of color horse. To kill with death means with pestilence, as the Hebrew word for pestilence or plague is used about 50 times in the Old Testament. It's translated in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, 30 plus times as the Greek word thanatos, which is death. That is like Thanos, where if you have seen the Avengers movies, the evil bad guy Thanos, that's just the Greek word for death. He is death. He's come to kill, and he actually, with the snap of his finger, they draw all of this stuff from the Bible. If you didn't know that, it all comes from the Bible. But Thanos, that is the Greek word for death, and it is essentially interchangeable there with pestilence. So various diseases and plagues and scary viruses, those sorts of things floating around, killing people. Because of the internal fighting and starvation of the Jews, conditions in besieged Jerusalem in 70 AD could readily be described in the terms found here. And of course, when you have people dying in their own homes or in the streets, and everybody's dying, and you're not really burying people, you're just letting their corpses rot wherever they might be, well, that is a place that is rife for various types of disease and plague and all kinds of gross things to be happening. The reference to the means of death, sword, hunger, plague, and beast of the earth are a deliberate echo of Ezekiel 14:21. I told you we would come back to that, and here now we have come back to it. Listen to this. This is out of Ezekiel, warning that God gives to Israel, for this is what the sovereign Lord says: how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine and wild beast and plagues, to kill its men and their animals. And this is precisely what is said here. This is precisely what John sees that the rider on the pale horse is coming to do. So this is another warning, another judgment of God from the Old Testament that is being visited, presumably on Israel in the first century, and possibly on Israel again in these latter days, and even on the whole world. In Ezekiel, God used these means to inflict judgment at the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC, which was a precursor to this event in 70 AD, similar in detail and in significance. So that happened. That did happen at the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and it could be described to have happened again there in the first century. And maybe again. This is how Josephus describes the scene. So all hope of escaping was now cut off from the Jews. They're completely surrounded by the Romans, together with their liberty of going out of the city. Then did the famine widen its progress and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of dead bodies of the aged. The seditious, as not enduring the stench of the dead bodies, had them cast down from the walls into the valleys beneath. If you remember when we were talking about the valley of Gehenna, we had talked about that at some point in here on a Sunday morning. I showed you a picture of that. There's this valley with sheer cliffs on either side, and that's where they would throw all of their refuse and dead bodies in this valley right there. It still exists there today in Jerusalem. That was piling up with dead bodies, a horrible stench. However, when Titus, in going his rounds along those valleys, saw them full of dead bodies and the thick putrefaction running about them, he gave a groan, and such was the sad case of the city itself. So that is how Josephus describes the scene there in Israel during the time of that siege, that there are just rotting, stinking bodies. I think when we were talking about Jesus raising Lazarus, I read a clinical description of what happens to bodies as they start to decompose, and it is somewhere right around day 4 that all of the gases in your body start kind of swelling, and the skin starts cracking, and fluids start oozing, and all of this terrible stuff starts happening. So you just have this horrible, gross scene of all of these dead bodies all over the place, which is being represented in this 4th rider. So the preterist is going to see the fulfillment there, and the futurist. Most futurists apply these seals to the end times tribulation. Death and Hades now attack human society. The great destruction sets in, the first effect of which is bewilderment and general havoc. As a 4th part of the inhabitants of the earth is destroyed by the sword, or by starvation, or by deadly diseases, or by wild beasts. So you have all of these things culminating until a quarter of the earth is dead. The area covered by this judgment, described as the earth, though sometimes only of the promised land given to Israel, so sometimes earth just means Israel, but it could also mean, again, the whole earth, is a general word referring to the inhabited world, and in this context apparently extends to the entire earth. Treated geographically, it would be equivalent to the destruction of more than the entire population of Europe and South America. So there's a lot of dead people. Somewhere around 2 billion, apparently. Because of the current world population being so great, 1/4 of the inhabitants would represent a number larger than those destroyed in Noah's day, presumably. We have no way of knowing how many people were alive in Noah's day, but this is a idea about it. Therefore, this would be the great tribulation of unprecedented magnitude spoken of by Jesus in Matthew 24:21, where he would say, a day of destruction such as the world has never seen before. And people are like, well, the whole world was destroyed one time. What are you talking about? And, well, it could very well be that a quarter of the earth's population now is more than the whole world in the time of Noah. That's the kind of justification there. Since Great Tribulation is the term that technically refers to only the final 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation, some believe that these seals apply strictly to that end period. So again, there is a reading of the book of Revelation where it is not entirely linear. And we would even say that we've kind of argued for that with the breaking of the seals and how this may just be the setting of a stage and not necessarily the subsequent unfolding of events, but that this is not, we have not actually entered into the Great Tribulation period, but this is a precursor of what is to come when these things are actually, when these riders are actually finally unleashed on the earth, but that this is not actually like a precursor to the Great Tribulation itself, if that makes sense. Others place the beginning of the Great Tribulation there at chapter 11. So could be here with the entry of the Antichrist, could be something that is still later to come. So essentially, the futurist is looking at the pale horse in really the same way that the preterist is looking at it, but just on a much larger scale, that you have some conqueror coming in, bent on conquest, who's then bent on war, all kinds of people killing each other, then horrible famine that happens and people just start dying of kind of natural causes, the natural cause of not having enough to eat, and then as all those people start dying, the deaths just kind of pile on top of each other, and death gives way to more death. What's very interesting as we conclude here is that you have, again, this picture where you have the red horse and the pale horse, who, again, we could call the green horse, if we wanted to call it such, the white horse and the black horse. They are these four colors, red, green, white, and black. And if we're talking about perhaps all of this judgment falling on the nation of Israel, what's very, very interesting is if you look at the national flags of all of the nations of the Middle East, here's a picture of what they all look like. See a lot of black and white and red and green in there. And there's one of those flags that's not quite like the other, is it? And it's just, I'm not saying anything about anything, but the entire Arab world pretty much cannot stand for Israel. They don't like Israel. They don't want Israel. It is, perhaps a cosmic coincidence that every single one of the nations surrounding Israel, and here's a map of the Middle East, and those are, the flags superimposed over the footprints of the given countries there, and you can just barely make out that little sliver of blue that's right there. And you have the nation of Israel completely surrounded by, all of these countries who, at the very least, will just say that they don't really get along with. And it's when you look at the odds in a war that might take place, they don't look so good for the little guys in blue and white right there. And it is interesting what is taking place in the Middle East right now and in Israel. And so far, I have been keeping up with it a little bit. So far, you just have the, Gaza. There is about the only place that is specifically involved, though there has been some stuff happening from Lebanon, a little bit of tremors from Lebanon with Hezbollah up there, and Iran has kind of started poking its finger into the fray here. And then, of course, having allies with Russia and China and all of these various things, you can see how we could be right on the cusp of things getting really, really crazy. And all of these futurist interpretations, and every single one of those things with the inflation and the diseases and the wars and all of those things, it's really easy for us to take a futurist view of all of this and to say it sure does seem like we're heading in that direction. We would love to say with the preterists all of that happened and it was just about the first century and we're just waiting for Jesus to come back, and not just to take the Christians out, not a rapture, but to actually just come back and fix it all. And perhaps he does. Perhaps he does before it gets completely mad down here. But I'd prepare your heart and your soul for the worst. That's just my advice to you as your pastor. I would pray and believe for the best, and I would be prepared for the worst. And whatever it means to be prepared for the worst, you can take that to the Lord, but at least to begin making peace in your heart that this is the era of human history that the Lord has placed you on the earth for. He has put you here for such a time as this, and We're going to have a part to play in it no matter what happens. So keep an eye on that, and we'll see if that's not any kind of indicator as to what's going to happen in the rest of the world. Only went a little bit over when you consider that we started late, so we did pretty good. Questions, comments, concerns?
What?
Questions, comments, concerns?
Lots of concerns.
Lots of concerns. We are reminded of the purpose of the book of Revelation, which is to present Jesus' victory over the powers of Satan. And we have been extremely privileged, all of us, to have been, most of us, born here in the United States, I think, and to live here for the better part of our lives. But our brothers and sisters across the whole world have been facing circumstances like those that we have just talked about since Jesus. We're just have been very, very fortunate. And for those sorts of things to befall us here, we would just be joining our brothers and sisters in what they've already been enduring for hundreds and thousands of years. So could be worrisome, but also if the Lord's bringing you to it, he's gonna get you through it. So he will give you the strength when whatever trial comes, if we keep our eyes fixed on him. Amen. Don't fret. Don't fret. We'll be talking about peace on Sunday morning. We will be lighting the peace candle, so you have that to look forward to. God, we thank you for your word, God. We thank you that you know the start from the end, that nothing is catching you by surprise, God, and we rest in that. And we know that even when it seems like things are completely out of control, that as hard as it might be for us to believe, God, everything is going according to your plan, that you have ordained all of this, God. And if you ordained your own torture and death, then it's not so far out of our ability to understand that you might have that in store for even some of us, God. And while we surely don't look forward to or desire that, God, we know that no matter what comes, no matter what kind of end we might come to in this existence here on earth, God, there is something far greater waiting for each and every one of us. And we do pray, God, that no matter our circumstance, and gosh, we don't need a great tribulation to come, God. We're going through enough stuff as it is right now. There are enough problems and difficulties and struggles represented in this room right now, God, that we need you. And I pray that as we study this book, that we are reminded over and over and over again that you are in control, that the victory is already won, that you have already done everything that needs to be done to secure for us a victory. And I pray that we would walk in that victory, God. I pray that we would walk in your truth and in your light and in your life, God. But we do pray for peace on the earth, God. We pray for your word and your gospel to make its way to the farthest reaches of the world and in the places where it seems most impossible that revival might take place. God, we pray for revival in those places. We pray, Lord, that you would have your way among the nations, that you would have your way in this nation, and that you would have your way in each one of our lives. We trust you, God. We believe in you. Let our hearts be encouraged. Let us be inspired. Let us be uplifted. We ask in your name. And all God's children said, Amen. It's going to be okay, guys. We're all gonna make it.